Among the yellowed pages of Marvin Gaye's old diary, an unpublished entry revealed a hidden truth that had lingered for decades in quiet backstage whispers. A list of 5 fellow artists he had shared deep, personal connections with. There were no grand statements or public confessions, only words penned in black ink, some lines crossed out in hesitation, others filled with emotion, as if even he could hardly believe what he had written. It isn't quite a confession, nor is it a full story. It feels more like a quiet whisper spoken to oneself in the long, solitary nights after the stage lights have faded and the applause has become just an echo of the past. If that list is real, it reveals not only a glimpse into the hidden corners of the life of the man once called the Prince of Soul, but also opens a window into the silent battles faced by those who live between the spotlight and the shadows. The names written there, once icons, once untouchable, now appear with a new kind of depth, fragile, human, and profoundly personal. And then he said only one line. That's not a song, that's a confession. The connection between Marvin and Luther, if it ever reached beyond professional respect, has never been confirmed. Yet perhaps that very uncertainty makes its echo even stronger. Some claim they never so much as touched. Others recall moments in the studio, Marvin standing still, one hand over his heart, his eyes quietly following Luther as he sang a look both peaceful and heavy with unspoken feeling. It isn't the pain of being hurt, it's the ache of knowing you shouldn't go any further, even when your heart has already crossed that line. From their very first collaborations, there was a quiet tension running beneath the surface, a contrast in how they saw themselves. Luther never hid, he simply chose silence. His quiet wasn't a mask, but a delicate veil protecting something fragile within. Marvin, on the other hand, was constantly torn between the man he truly was and the image the world demanded him to be. Born into the household of a strict pastor and raised to be the ideal man, strong, stoic, masculine Marvin learned to turn everything unspoken into music. But music alone was never enough to save him. It was only the beautiful sigh of a soul that had never been allowed to weep. Luther, meanwhile, never seemed to restrain himself. He sang as if carrying someone he loved deep within someone whose name could never be spoken aloud. And that was what frightened Marvin, not out of hatred, but because he saw a reflection of himself, only he wasn't brave enough to face it. Once, during a brief backstage interview at Motown, when asked about Luther, Marvin simply smiled, that quiet, knowing smile. That man sings as if he's never known fear. And me, I write love songs for the radio, not for the one I truly love. There had been plenty of chances for them to grow closer. They recorded 3 songs together in the early 1,980 seconds, yet only one ever made it to release. The remaining version vanished from the archives, leaving not a single trace behind. One engineer who had been there recalled, "The session went great, better than great." But then, something shifted. It was like they both realized they were playing with fire, and neither wanted to be the first to get burned. Years later, whispers began to circulate that one of those lost recordings was the original demo of There's Nothing Better Than Love, which Luther would later perform as a duet with Gregory Hines. Someone close to the team once murmured that the first version had been sung with Marvin, but he chose not to let it see the light of day. Maybe it was simply too personal. Maybe he feared revealing a part of himself that was never meant to be seen. Nothing has ever been confirmed, but those who claim to have heard that recording all say the same thing. It wasn't just music, it was 2 souls quietly speaking to each other through every line. There was no need for a touch, no need for exchanged glances under the lights. Just a soft meeting between 2 melodies, a brief harmony in the chorus, a subtle pause when Luther held a note a little longer than usual, as if waiting for Marvin to catch up with the feeling. Luther often wrote about lovers without names or faces, if they existed at all. They lived only in the shadows. But with Marvin, Luther became a mirror reflecting everything he tried to bury deep inside. What they shared was something rare: loneliness. Both knew what it meant to love in silence, to live behind a mask carefully shaped to fit expectations. Yet their connection wasn't built solely on empathy. At times, it sparked tension. A close friend once admitted that Marvin seemed uneasy whenever Luther's name came up. "He's too perfect, too careful," Marvin would say. "But he doesn't even sweat. How can that be real?" Yet everyone knew those words weren't sincere. Because if Luther wasn't real, why did Marvin's eyes soften every time he heard him sing? Some of the most beautiful love stories are the ones that are never spoken aloud. That line doesn't belong to Marvin, nor to Luther, but perhaps they both understood it better than anyone else. And yet, when people speak of their connection, that single line is the one most often repeated because it reaches into the deepest kind of ache, loving someone you can never name, not for lack of courage, but for living in a time that wasn't ready for such truth. The story between Marvin and Luther needs no ending. It lingers like an unfinished song, wordless, without a climax, yet impossible to forget. They never loved each other openly. But if they ever loved each other or even just wished they could, that alone was enough to change them both. Marvin's later ballads grew deeper, more vulnerable. Luther sang as if his voice was meant for only one person, even when standing before millions. And perhaps, just perhaps, they thought of each other sometimes alone in the studio late at night, with nothing but the echo of their own voices for company. Marvin never spoke of it. Luther kept his silence until the very end. But between them, it was the silence that said everything. The instrumental breaks between the verses say it all. And perhaps that silence was the truest love song they ever created together, one that was never released. Marvin Gaye had strong opinions about soul music being sung by white artists. He spoke openly about it during a press conference in Detroit, his tone calm but cutting. "They take our sound, polish it, and then sell it back to us, and we applaud." No one could argue with that. There are people in life whose names we never speak, not because we've forgotten them, but because saying their name would hurt too much. Marvin Gaye once saw Prince dancing alone beneath the dim lights of an old, dusty Hollywood studio, a cigarette unlit between his fingers. He wanted to move closer, but something held him still. Not fear, but the quiet certainty that he shouldn't. Not from a lack of affection, but because there was already too much of it. That connection was never really a secret, only a story that no one ever told in full. Everyone tells only fragments of the story. Some say they once saw Marvin and Prince sitting side by side in the Motown waiting room, 2 hours of silence between them, not a single word exchanged. Others insist they heard Marvin humming an unreleased tune, repeating the words "Purple Moon Rising." No one knows if it was coincidence or intention. A late sound engineer once recalled in a faint, half-forgotten interview. One night, he walked into the studio and found Prince rehearsing alone. He didn't speak, he simply stood there and watched until the very end. The problem was never the music. The truth was that Prince himself was almost beyond comprehension at the time. He defied every norm, from his hair and clothes to the way he used his voice. Marvin, the son of a strict preacher, was raised in the shadow of his father's grief and doubt, shaped by the traditions of a community fighting to preserve its image in a judgmental world. For a man like him, loving another man was already a quiet battle. Loving someone like Prince, that was something even harder to face. Marvin's generation lived in a time when black men weren't allowed to show weakness, not just in the eyes of the world, but even within their own communities. He once said, "They want you to sing about the pain, but they don't want you to show it." Prince was different. He didn't just sing about pain, he embodied it, danced with it, and made it his own. He didn't seek approval, he sought truth. And that, more than anything, both fascinated and unsettled Marvin. If you've ever listened to the healing of desire through the ears of someone who has truly loved, you'll hear a quiet plea hidden within the music, the cry of a soul with nowhere to escape. Beneath the sighs and the sensual words lies another meaning entirely, a confession that Marvin himself could never name. Some say he wrote it during a period of deep reflection, when his thoughts often wandered to Prince. No one can prove it, but no one can quite dismiss it either. In theory, Prince and Marvin could never belong to each other. On one side stood the symbol of freedom. On the other, the embodiment of restraint and inner conflict. Yet because of that contrast, a strange pull existed between them. Like light and shadow, they could never merge, but neither could exist without the other. In 1981, they reportedly stayed at the same hotel in Minneapolis during a backstage event. Rumor has it that Prince rehearsed a piece inspired by Marvin's distant lover, and from the wings, Marvin was seen wiping away tears. One witness recalled that he didn't return to the stage as scheduled that night. Instead, he quietly went back to his room. That night, the show was canceled without a word of explanation. Later, in a radio interview, Marvin simply said, "There are nights when the voice of the heart is louder than the voice itself." What's remarkable is that, despite Prince's reputation for fearlessness and his defiance of every convention, he never confirmed or denied any connection between them. When asked about Marvin Gaye in an interview with Rolling Stone, Prince only smiled and said, "Some people sing as if they're hiding something. Marvin sings as if he's trying to set it free." Their story, if it can even be called that, is neither a romance nor simply a friendship. It is a connection between two wounded souls, one choosing to scream in silence, the other turning pain into light. Between them stretched a distance not of age, but of era, of expectation, of a fear too deep to name. Perhaps that's why Marvin never spoke Prince's name in any personal confession, except once, when a journalist asked which contemporary artist made him feel uneasy. He once said quietly, "There are people who remind me of what I could never become." It wasn't a confession of love, it was a silence woven deep into the melody of Marvin Gaye's life. A stillness only those who have carried the weight of unspoken longing can understand. No confirmation is needed, no proof required. Sometimes, it's enough just to feel. Some things are never written in ink, yet they live on in every note, every lingering glance, every invisible tear that falls between the broken beats of a song. And if someone were to ask whether Marvin Gaye ever loved Prince, the most honest answer might be this: he once wished he could. But not everyone is granted the freedom to live as their true self, especially a black man in a time when simply being authentic could push you to the edge of society. Marvin kept that truth to himself, not out of shame, but out of understanding that sometimes the cost of being seen is greater than what a lonely heart can bear. He was deeply moved the first time he heard Ashi's demo of If Only for One Night. It wasn't just the melody though, it flowed softly, like silk, nor entirely the lyrics, tender and precise, layered with quiet ache. It was the way Luther Vandross delivered each line, as if every syllable carried the weight of an old wound. There was something unspoken in his voice, yet it resonated more than words ever could. When the song ended, Marvin sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. But no one ever brought it up again. It was a truth too delicate for anyone to touch. So when George Michael walked into a London recording studio on a gray October afternoon in 1983, the industry began to whisper. A young white British star, fresh from the rise of Wham, had chosen Marvin Gaye as his mentor and collaborator. For many, it seemed an unnecessary act of boldness. For Marvin, it was a beautiful contradiction he couldn't quite make sense of. But he came anyway, not for George, but out of curiosity, and perhaps because he recognized something of himself in that young man's polished yet conflicted exterior. He walked in like he already knew the place, recalled Anthony, the sound engineer on set. But when George saw Marvin, he froze not in fear, but as if he were suddenly face to face with the person he had always hoped to become. That moment was never documented anywhere official. Yet the memory lives on as a closely guarded secret among the few who were in that studio that day. Rumor has it there's an unreleased demo featuring both Marvin's and George's voices, and to this day, no one dares to reveal where it is. Anthony, the engineer mentioned earlier, later said the meeting wasn't just about music. There was something else in the air, a charged energy, a quiet tension. Not competition, but something far more human. It wasn't competition. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding between two men from entirely different worlds, yet bound by the same restless soul. George never hid his admiration. He looked at Marvin as a mentor, though he couldn't disguise the spark of joy in his eyes. Some say they once saw him standing before Marvin's portrait at the EMI studio, silent for several minutes. When asked about it, George only smiled softly and said, "He sings as if," and left the rest hanging in the air. It has been suffering for centuries. Ironically, Marvin noticed George too, not for his fame or his music, but for the way he wrestled with acceptance, just as Marvin once had in his early Motown days. It was the same inner battle, the longing to be loved without losing oneself, the ache of a soul that refused to see color. That understanding was wordless, it resonated in their eyes. That encounter, brief as it was, lingered far longer than a single day. It was enough to awaken a hidden corner of Marvin's soul. Anthony recalled that after George left, Marvin sat in silence for more than an hour. He stayed in the studio, staring at the blinking console lights, his fingers tapping softly to a rhythm no one else could hear. At last, he murmured, "That kid. He knows the things I've tried to forget." The demo was said to be titled, "Through the Silence." No one beyond that small circle in the studio ever heard the full recording. One person, however, still remembers the chorus. George's voice intertwined with Marvin's on the track. "If we speak, we will break it. If we stay silent, we will pretend." If those lyrics are indeed real, they point to something far beyond music, a connection both fragile and profound. Rumor has it Marvin chose not to release the recording, not because it lacked quality, but because it felt too honest. He once told his manager, "This one isn't for the world. It's for the moments when I forget who I am." In later years, George often spoke about that recording session. In a 1997 BBC interview, when asked if anyone had ever made him nervous while singing together, he simply replied, "One person, but he's no longer here." Few people know that George Michael once considered covering Marvin's Distant Lover for his debut solo album, Faith, but ultimately decided against it. "It was," he said, "too personal." If this story moved you even just a little, please give it a like to let us know you're still listening. Share this video so more people can discover the forgotten truths and untold memories behind the music. And if you'd like to keep joining us on this journey into the emotional depths of sound and the souls behind the spotlight, don't forget to subscribe. Because this isn't just music, these are lives that have loved, been broken, and still echo in every note. A close friend once recalled that George tried to sing that song but stopped halfway through. Not because he couldn't, but as if something had caught in his throat. He didn't cry, yet his eyes carried a quiet weight. If the story is true, then their meeting became one of the most silent yet profound moments in the history of modern soul, an unnamed chapter, but one that still reverberates. Marvin passed away not long after. George never spoke of it again. But if you truly listen to Jesus to a Child, George's timeless ballad, you'll hear something unmistakable, a particular warmth in the tone, a lingering phrasing, a soft, soulful depth that echoes Marvin Gaye. No one calls it a direct influence, yet anyone who has heard Marvin sing, "When Did You Stop Loving Me?" knows that only he could give loneliness such a voice. George didn't learn that from any school, he learned it through living, through feeling. He came out publicly in 1998, years after Marvin was gone. In a rare interview, George once said, "There are people who make us feel safe being ourselves, yet they were never able to live as their true selves." If that sentiment was meant for Marvin, it's a heartbreaking thought. a pioneer who inspired generations, yet never found the freedom to be authentic. If there was ever a spark of emotion between George and Marvin, it was a quiet one, a connection that lived not in words or gestures, but in the spaces between them. Not every story finds its way into history. Some things can only live in memory, in the dim glow of a studio light, within the unreleased recordings, or in the silence between two notes, where two people see each other, understand everything, yet cannot put it into words. George Michael and Marvin Gaye. One stood in the spotlight, longing to disappear. The other lived in the shadows, yearning for a moment of truth. Sometimes, all it takes is the brush of a hand, a shared glance, and two lives are never the same again. And that recording, if it truly exists, still lies somewhere in an old London archive, unreleased and unheard, like a promise quietly buried by time. Those who know of it, or simply choose to believe in it, understand that it was never just about music. There are moments that don't need proof, only faith that they once happened. Marvin was never afraid of noise. It was the language of his life. He had grown up surrounded by sound, the echoes of his ancestors' cries, the hollow applause of the stage, the guitar's weary wail through his headphones, and the condescending laughter of those who thought they understood him. But there was one kind of noise Marvin could never bear: the wild freedom of others, especially when he himself had never dared to live that way. Then came Sylvester. No one was ready for the phenomenon he embodied. He was unlike anyone else. He sang as if he were on fire from within, danced as if every movement were a sacred ritual. Draped in glittering fabrics, his soaring falsetto shattered every boundary of gender and expectation. In an era when the music industry still trembled before difference, Sylvester walked onto the dance floor and made his declaration clear: I exist whether you accept it or not.